Welcome to All Systems Ergo, a human factors and ergonomics podcast delving into the fascinating world of healthcare. My name is Fran Ives and I am a chartered human factors specialist. I'm naturally curious about people, and throughout this series I want to explore different areas of healthcare human factors and the people who work in this diverse discipline. So welcome everybody. My guest today is Tracey Herlihey, who is the Head of Patient Safety Incident Response Policy at NHS England. Now, many listeners will know and associate Tracey with the development of PISA, the Patient Safety Incident Response Framework. But prior to working at NHS England, Tracey was based at the Health Services Safety Investigations Body, which investigates patient safety concerns across healthcare settings in England. Tracey has a psychology background and spent a number of years in Canada in academia and then latterly at University Health Network. And I really want to explore Tracey's journey from psychology to academia and to where she is now at NHS England. So Tracey, welcome today and thanks for joining me.
Oh, thanks for having me.
So I'm sure that many of our listeners would probably know you from your patient safety incident response framework work that you're currently undertaking at NHS England. But what I'd really like to do is start off by exploring some of the many things that you did before your PISA life, because there is a life before PISA. And you started your human factors route through your psychology degree. Was it always your intention to move into the human factors world, or did that desire come later?
No, I mean, I don't even think I'd heard of human factors back in the day when I was doing my undergrad and then even really my PhD. It's probably floating around, but not something I'd kind of come across or considered. And I really only started to consider it much later on after I'd done kind of a postdoc. And I was really trying to figure out, I knew I had this real interest for applying psychology. Like I really wanted to take that knowledge and apply it. And so I was trying to look for things to do along those lines. And that's kind of where I fell into it, really. I started off doing some user experience research. And that was kind of interesting. But some of the, as in a consulting role, some of the things were around, let's help this large organization redesign their intranet, which I guess is good for them, but not necessarily the most interesting of projects. And that's when I realized I wanted to do something along these lines, but to do it in a more meaningful way. And that's how I ended up moving into healthcare and starting work at Healthcare Human Factors in Toronto.
So psychology is a really broad starting point, isn't it? And we've spoken to a couple of other psychologists about how they've got to human factors. I'm always interested in that question and understanding people's roots. So I find it interesting. Actually, you didn't really necessarily know what human factors was when you started out in psychology, but sort of over time and sometimes it's sets of circumstances or differing experiences that kind of leads you into that arena. You mentioned that you worked in Canada and you spent some time in academia and then in healthcare. Tell me a little bit more about the work that you did over there.
Yeah, I mean, so when I first moved, I was mostly kind of doing a postdoc, and that was more like cognitive neuroscience, basic sciencey stuff. But like I said, I then moved into the UX and then to Healthcare Human Factors, and that was still is a consulting organization based in downtown Toronto at the University Health Network, which is a network of a number of different hospitals across Toronto. And we used to do all kinds of stuff there. So predominantly, we had simulation labs, so we could do a lot of simulation work. We could host kind of both formative and summative studies, usability studies. So to help inform the design of medical technology, medical devices, and also to evaluate their design, particularly for the FDA in the States. Did a lot of work around procurement. So if one large piece of work, so the hospitals wanted to procure a new infusion pumps, we were able to do a comparative analysis, like usability test of different infusion pumps that had been shortlisted, and to provide some feedback around kind of the safety and the usability aspects of them, which then kind of fed into the kind of engineering aspects, looking at the the reliability and the specificity of the devices. We were able to do stuff along those lines. So quite a lot of the work focused on technology, but also I got to do some really kind of interesting, unusual things as well. So one of the projects that kind of really sticks in my mind, and I will forever, I think, it was like it was a really enjoyable, interesting piece of work, was to look at the implementation of e-health technologies in remote and isolated communities in Canada. So this work was commissioned by Health Canada, and we worked with a university in British Columbia to lead this work. And it involved kind of, we wanted to kind of look at the implementation of e-health technologies, taking this human factors approach. Really important to understand the context within which users would be using this technology and to understand the people who would be using it. So it involved doing a lot of ethnography or observations within the context. And so I think there were 3 or 4 sites that I had to fly into all across Canada. So some in Ontario, Saskatchewan as well, different provinces. And so I flew in on these tiny little planes and spent some time there in these really remote communities in the middle of winter, freezing cold, and just kind of watched how people worked in the nursing stations there, looked at the technologies that were already there, and really just tried to understand a lot about the context and what could or couldn't work, and also the culture as well, and how the impact of culture on what, if you're doing consultations more remotely, then how does that impact on, how would that be accepted by the culture? So yeah, it was a really interesting, worthwhile piece of work, and it really went to demonstrate, if you want to try and introduce these telehealth technologies in places that were so remote, where internet access was variable. The one station had a satellite on the roof, and I remember one poor guy having to go outside in minus 35 degrees to climb on the roof to adjust the satellite to get internet. Now that isn't really a good setting to go solely, to electronic health solutions, although they have their benefits. So it's just a really interesting project. And then my role then for the people who commissioned the work was then to host, demonstrate, I guess, a potential nursing station of the future. And so I brought in some different technology vendors, and we hosted like a sharing event day in Toronto, where we brought people in from the nursing stations, some technology vendors, and Health Canada to talk about some of the things that may work or had already started to be introduced in some nursing stations. And it was just a really interesting project. That will stay with me forever, I think.
And I guess that really showed to you the importance of being able to actually meet the people involved in the system, the patients and the staff, and actually see for yourself, what happens, how people behave, what their thoughts are. And I often think in human factors, the most valuable things that we have in our toolbox are our eyes and our ears, and just that ability to watch and to listen. Because I'm guessing in such a huge expanse such as Canada, there are those different cultures that we're just not really going to properly understand unless we go there and we see it for ourselves and we speak to people and we properly understand what they feel about things, how they behave. And we understand that's important in the UK, but I think in a country the size of Canada, it's even more important to understand those communities.
Yeah, I mean, and just the constraints as well. Like one thing I remember when I was in one station was somebody trying to gain access to their computer and they couldn't remember the password.
Yeah.
So then they had to make a phone call to their IT support, but the telephone wasn't a portable phone. So but the telephone was in a different room to the computer. So then they had to leave. And so there's just kind of, so they had to be on the phone in one room.
Yeah.
Run to another room, type some things into the computer, and then run back. And if you ask somebody about their work and the stuff they do every day, that isn't something I think they would comment on in particular, because that's just work for them. They've got they just work around it. But then being there, and you get the opportunity to really understand some of the constraints that every day people just don't think about. It's just the stuff that they have to overcome. So that was was really interesting as well, and just demonstrating the importance of observing people, and like you said, using your eyes. I think I'm going to take that one away too.
Yeah. And you and fresh eyes as well, which I think is exactly what you've very nicely described. Actually being able to see those things, those challenges that the nurses wouldn't necessarily think to tell you, because that's just what they do. But because you're new to it, you are walking in for the first time, and you often do pick up on things that you think, crikey, that's really challenging, or why on earth does that happen? And it's not until you start to sort of talk to people that they realise, yeah, but that's just what we do. Hadn't really thought that was a problem, because it's just part of our normal work, and that could be, incredibly valuable.
Yeah, and one of the I guess, so there's that side to it, but then there's also the perception. It just kind of made me think of this different project where we were looking at the design of personal protective equipment. So this was during the Ebola crisis outbreak, and there was a real concern. So staff really wanted more protection. They felt like when they were in a kind of more personal protective equipment, that they were more protected from Ebola.
Right.
But then when you actually watched what it took to remove this equipment that was a lot more complex, removing the equipment actually gave itself more opportunities for cross-contamination in these tiny little rooms. So again, that watching people removing the equipment in the context where they would be removing it really showed how unsafe this complex equipment was, compared to, I guess, less PPE, like a gown rather than a full bodysuit. Was much easier to remove quite quickly, potentially less opportunities for cross-contamination. So again, really this was interesting, because we did it in this was in a number of different hospitals in their kind of ante rooms where they would be removing it. And some ante rooms are really small, and you thought, well, that's quite there's opportunities there to brush up against the bin and the walls and so on. But then in one organization where the ante room was much larger, you had other issues where the bin was on the other side of the room. So people would be shuffling across the floor to put things in the bin before removing things off their feet, and throwing things across the room to get it into the bin. So it's just so important to watch people do their work, because that's just insight you wouldn't gather from just asking people about what they do every day.
No, absolutely. And that's one of the frustrations that I had when I worked in the nuclear industry, because the power stations were so far away. When we were doing pieces of work, often we were relying on things like phone calls, emails, photographs, etc. And whilst that provided some really valuable information, for me as a human factors specialist, it just felt like we were still missing a huge chunk, because we weren't always there to be able to observe. And it's those seemingly little things that you observe that actually are hugely important, and are really the big things.
Yeah.
The work that you did with Ebola, I wonder what impact that had on any work that you did around COVID, or even that particular healthcare organisation, because back then, I suppose we felt really quite new and unsure about such levels of PPE. And if we sort of move on to where we are beginning of 2024, we're a few years beyond March 2020, but PPE was sort of pretty much all we thought about for a long while. Were there any lessons learnt, do you think, from that Ebola work that were actually useful to take forward into COVID?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. We were really lucky that we were able to take some of that work to the WHO. So we went to Geneva, and it's so interesting. There were a whole bunch of manufacturers of PPE that came to this meeting. We flew in, a colleague of mine flew in together, and it was just so interesting thinking about how what PPE is designed for, and it isn't necessarily designed to be used in the healthcare context where it is. And there are certain things that we kind of thought about around the design of PPE, around how the colour on the inside and the outside was the same. So when you're removing it, it's quite difficult to tell which bit may be contaminated and which bit may not be contaminated. So that was one thing. And then, of course, there was stuff around, how hot it is. And then I know there was stuff that was done during the pandemic. I don't know if it was led by Sue Hignett or not. That was looking specifically at the design and how it fit different body shapes and body sizes and so on. So I think there was absolutely stuff we could take away, but I guess more so around the design of the donning and doffing stations. So looking at how you set up where you put different pieces of equipment, and then how you set up bins for people to remove their equipment afterwards, and just watching people use it. And if they're reaching, so for Ebola, people would put gloves on and then tape them because they didn't around their wrist, but then taking that tape off was so difficult. But then thinking about, well, where would you put that tape in relation to the gloves so people aren't moving around? So there's loads of stuff you can take away, like where we positioned bins in a room when people were removing stuff, how people removed stuff and how the design of the equipment lends itself to being removed in a particular way. And it was just really interesting speaking to the manufacturers of the PPE to see if they test the usability, I guess, of their equipment to make it easier to put on and off. And things may have changed since then, but I always remember one manufacturer saying, "Oh, that was the responsibility of the end user to make sure that they could take it off." But actually, there's a lot that could be done in the design of the technology itself to make it easier for people to do that, even in something as simple as PPE.
Yeah, absolutely. So just thinking then, your transition from Canada, where it sounds like you were able to be involved in some really fascinating pieces of work, you moved back to the UK to take up a post in the newly established HSIB, which is quite a transition. How did you find that transition?
It was interesting. It was always something I was trying to get more into in my role in Canada, but wasn't really able to kind of, even though we were based in a hospital in Toronto, just wasn't really able to get into that kind of line of work or to influence that type of work in the hospital. So I was growing more and more interested in it, and I was doing a lot of training around human factors, and I'm really enjoying that. I'd always done a lot of teaching before then anyway, and so I was really enjoying delivering the training and wanted to grow the training. But the more I was doing it, the more I was realizing that this whole world of safety investigation and wasn't really able to have a lot of influence on that in where I was working in Canada. So it seemed a really good opportunity, and I guess why wouldn't you want to be part of this world first organization to really look at to have that opportunity to really look at the system factors. That was the real the kind of real selling point for me. So it wasn't as difficult as a transition as I guess you would think, because I just saw it as such a good opportunity. I think my husband would say it was a bit more of a difficult transition for him because he's Canadian and so on, and it involved him having to move to England. But yeah, no, I really saw the benefit of having that organization and was really kind of driven by that. And but I guess when we first came over, there's all that stuff that comes with being part of an organization that there's just you and 10 other people potentially, a few more, like in a room, and you have to kind of figure it out and get going. And so that was interesting, kind of working in that kind of ambiguity. But it also led, because it just led to other opportunities. So meeting colleagues from different investigation branches, and just the interest in the organization itself just led to so many different avenues. And the people there as well, who brought all the different experience from different industries. It was just fascinating. So it was I wouldn't go back and change it. Although I don't know if I would do it again, move to a different country and kind of relocate in the way that we did. But yeah, it was a good experience.
And I'm guessing that moving from Canada, where you've been quite well established, but moving to the UK, you're almost having to start again in terms of building up your own networks and your own contacts, which is quite a daunting thing. But I'm guessing really though, working at somewhere like HSIP, it's something that you can do relatively quickly, and have that sort of support and that network around you, and the ability to learn from people from all sorts of different backgrounds with different experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. And so when I first came back, I didn't really have any connections in human, or any connections that I knew were explicitly in human factors. I guess I knew I had some colleagues and I guess people who I'd worked with when I was in Cardiff and so on when I was doing my PhD, but without knowing actually that was human factors at the time. But I think, yeah, absolutely, working at HSIB definitely helped with building those connections because of the interest in the organization. And also having the Chartered Institute was really useful too. So we didn't have something similar to that in Canada. So when I first moved back, having that as an opportunity to network and the conferences and so on was really helpful. I think that's how I met most people initially, was through the conference. So yeah, it was quite different. And then especially the likes of Stephen Sharrock, who everybody knows, who when I was in Canada was just this person who was from the UK who kind of wrote all this great stuff, and then you get to meet these people, and that was quite exciting too.
So once HSIP was sort of starting to form and get settled, what sort of pieces of work stand out to you from your time there?
Yeah, so I mean, so when I first started, I was a national investigator, and I think I only did that for about a year before I moved into a different role. But I think some of that investigation work was, I guess, some of the best times that I had when I was there. Working with just a small team of investigators. So it'd be just a small team of us working on a specific investigation, often multidisciplinary, and kind of going out and about, meeting different people, and really trying to understand that context. So doing observations in all kinds of places. I learned a lot about how to kind of try to put people at ease coming in as this external kind of organization. I'll always remember when I went to do some observations in a theatre once, and I was introduced as this is Tracey from HSIB, who would like to observe you doing your WHO checklist, which I guess isn't necessarily how you want to be introduced when you're because it's just going to affect behavior and so on. So it learns a lot about that. But I think when I had a really good time kind of doing the investigation work, but then there was this opportunity as HSIB was becoming more mature to really start to think some more around how decisions were made around investigations, and how we had some criteria around that, and there was an opportunity to develop a small team to look at the referrals and do assessments on that to help inform which investigations HSIB would take on. And so I moved into that role, and that's what I did then until I left at the end of 2020.
So from HSIP you moved to NHS England, which is where you are now, and your current post is Head of Patient Safety Incident Response Policy. And I'm sure that during that time you've probably lived and breathed PSERP. But there may well be some people who are listening who don't know what PSERP is. So can you just give us a short overview of what PSERP is?
Yeah. So PSERP, so the Patient Safety Incident Response Framework. It is really, it's replacing what was previously in place, the Serious Incident Framework, which specifies how the NHS in England should respond to safety events for learning and improvement. So previously we had this framework in place which was a little bit more prescriptive. Everything that met a certain threshold of seriousness required an investigation, and the methodology was very specific. It required an RCA. If we go back and look at the serious incident framework and some of the aims it was set up to achieve, I don't think we would disagree with those aims now. It's just how processes and systems were set up under the guidance of that framework just didn't enable us to achieve those aims. And so PSEP is really trying to change that. So it's really starting to look at how the processes that we design within our organizations, what they look like and how they enable us to learn and improve. So there are 4 main principles under it, and so under PSEP, every learning response conducted, it must be compassionate, so engaging with those affected. It must be systems based, so taking a systems approach to how we learn from safety events. It should be proportionate, so moving away from that kind of threshold and always responding to the same things, and it should be supported. So there's lots of changes in there around how we oversee safety. So it was published in August 2022. There's lots of information about it on the NHS England website, and with the expectation that organisations would transition around autumn in 2023. Yeah. And so we were around that time. We I think we've got over half organisations transitioned as of the end of last year, with the expectation that we'll see a real peak in transition over the next few months leading up to the 1st of April, when it comes into the NHS standard contract.
So it's a huge challenge, isn't it, to work on the development and launch of PISA? What attracted you to that challenge?
Yeah. Well, I think when I was at HSIB, you see the real opportunity to make those big recommendations, across a system. You could really influence, say, medical device regulation or things like that. So there's the real opportunity to do that. But I think a lot where the biggest influence is on safety, I think, are the activities that happen every day in every organization, and how every organization goes about responding to safety events, learning from them, and building that into a wider program of improvement. And so I was really taken by the opportunity to have that kind of broader influence, because I guess at HSSIB, I was in the national team, may do up to 30 investigations a year. There are many more that are happening across the NHS. So I guess that was one of my main drivers for kind of making that shift across, not necessarily because I had a huge policy background or anything, but I saw there's a real opportunity to kind of make improvements there, really. And the team at NHSE had already done such a huge amount of work, in the development of the National Patient Safety Strategy, and it was all kind of moving in the right direction. So although I kind of, picked it up when I started in 2021, in January 21, there was already so much work that had already happened. I kind of just picked it up and ran with it with the team, but there was already so much development work. The introductory version had already been published at that point. We were testing it with early adopters. It was almost kind of a human factors development process in itself. You kind of design something, you kind of test it, then you iterate on it, and so on. So yeah, I mean, it's just been a huge eye-opening experience, learning about all the different ways, I guess, that the serious incident framework touches the NHS. Like, it seems to touch every kind of nook and cranny of the NHS.
And how important was it for you to really try and integrate a human factor systems approach into PISA?
Yeah, I mean, I think it was one of the first things I tried to do. My policy writing skills were not great, but when I was trying to think about, so we had our early adopters, and they, provided a huge amount of really good, important feedback, and we had the independent evaluation. And so what my first thing to do was to say, okay, well, how if we think about this, if we use, I went away and I kind of started to create all these diagrams using SEEPs to think, well, what if we start with the outcome? What is the outcome we want to get from learning and responding to safety events? And if you really go down into the nitty gritty of like SEEPs 2.0, you go, what are the outcomes that we want that are proximal and distal for patients and for staff for the organization? And you really start to think of some of the things that you're trying to get. What are the outcomes that the organization wants? They want to maintain their staffing. They don't want staff to leave. They want their staff to be satisfied, but they've been treated well as part of this. They want to have a certain culture. They want the certain things that the organization wants, certain things that patients want out of the process of learning, having been involved or affected by a safety event, and then things that staff want. And then when you really start to break it down, and then you start to think about the processes that sit underneath that, and then I guess the works, and it really helped me kind of think about things that we may not have thought about before. The problem was trying to translate that into a policy document. So I guess if you read the framework at first glance, you probably would never think, oh, actually, SEEPs was used to inform the design of it. But it absolutely was, there when I thought it was important, if we'd use SEEPs at HSIB, it was starting to get used. If it was something we were going to recommend to the system, I wanted to make sure we tested it out. It wasn't necessarily in the context of an investigation, but definitely used prospectively to design something going forward. So yeah, it was, embedding, of course, you need to have your systems thinking as one of the, taking a systems-based approach as one of the main principles of PSEF, but also having that systems-based approach in actually the design of the entire framework and the design of how we go about organizing our work to enable us to learn and improve, and in the design about how we go about thinking about designing safety actions and so on and monitoring them. I think this, you can use it in all aspects.
And how do you think people have responded to the concept of this systems-based thinking when you've gone out and started to talk to people in healthcare organisations about PSEF?
Yeah, I think generally it's been quite positive. I think the biggest change, I think organisations were quite familiar of looking at different contributory factors and but popping them in buckets and like keeping them in their buckets, if that makes sense. So I think you would have, we've got our technology problems over here and we've got our organization problems in this bucket. And I think what has potentially been a real change with the introduction of PSEF and one of the reasons why we wanted to use SEEPs was thinking, well, actually it's the relationships between the buckets that are the most meaningful. And I think that's taken quite a while to get to grips with, and it's something that we'll continue to think about for quite a long time, about what that means and how we kind of describe our findings and develop recommendations and safety actions and so on. But I think generally it seems to be quite positive. People seem to be getting to grips with SEEPs. So at first we tried to keep SEEPs as a one single framework throughout the learning response toolkit, to be able to just have that story, I guess, and not to flip between different system-based frameworks that, others are available. I'd always known that, in some pockets in mental health that HFAC, so the human factors analysis and classification system, was used and was preferred. But as, we've gone on over the last 12 months, I haven't really heard any other people talking about anything other than SEEPs, really. But then there was a really interesting challenge at the conference, the Chartered Institute conference last year, is that it's still really important to recognize that SEEPs is just one lens to enable you to look at your system. And with that, it comes, it kind of can block out other ways of, if you want to look at a system, for example, from a high reliability organization perspective or a normal accidents perspective, they will give you different ways of understanding I guess, complexity within your organization. So there is that, I guess, downside at the moment, that there is so much focus on one framework. And I guess that just the importance of recognizing that it's just one lens that we're using. And so that, in the future, there may be an opportunity to start to bring in different lenses and to try those out to see how they may impact, how we learn and how we turn that into improvements.
I suppose with SEEPs, though, it's you're right in saying it is just one framework. But one of the things I quite like about SEEPs is that when I talk to people about SEEPs and explain it, it's something that they seem to pick up and understand with relative ease. So I wonder if, that's a really good starting point to get people introduced to the concept of human factors in systems thinking. Actually, we can build on that in the future to then start to look at other frameworks without sort of scaring people right from the off.
Yeah, and that's why it was important, I guess, to have that one thread running through the toolkit. Because at first, if somebody looks at that image, I mean, we tried to simplify it a bit in our kind of SEEPs overview tool. But if you first look at that image with its triangle and circles and blobs and stuff, it is quite overwhelming. But I think we've got past that a little, quite a bit now, and people are starting to use it and understand it. But if you had that alongside something else, I think that wouldn't help.
I think also, I would often say to people that SEEPs can be used at lots of different stages of a piece of work. It's not just something that can be used to look at an incident. Actually, it can be used at the beginning of a project, partway through, to do a bit of benchmarking. So if somebody starts to get to grips with SEEPs, I think there's plenty of opportunities for them to start using it proactively, which for me as a human factors specialist in healthcare, if I started to see people doing that sort of systems thinking right at the very beginning of a project, I'd be absolutely delighted to see that. So whilst it does have its limitations, I think the fact that SEEPs can be used at different points within a piece of work can be really quite useful, and hopefully it will encourage people to start to think about those system elements a little bit sooner, because that's always one of our bugbears, isn't it, as human factors specialists. We want to be involved in projects right at the beginning, and all too often we get called in at a late stage, and whilst there's still lots of things that we can add to a project, we're sort of getting a bit frustrated sometimes that we weren't there right at the beginning. And I wonder, although time will be the teller, whether this will help. So you mentioned PSERF was launched last year, but I'm guessing that's not the end of PSERF for you. So what next? What's next for you in terms of PSERF?
So I mean, there's loads of stuff. So PSERF, as it's published, it's in the NHS standard contract, so it applies there, to, well, predominantly secondary care. There are some primary care services that are commissioned through that contract, but predominantly we're talking secondary care at the moment. So there's a huge opportunity there within primary care, which are many different industries in themselves. We started out with when we first had the early adopter program evaluated, one of the recommendations was to do further work around PSERF and primary care to understand how the principles could be applied, because, for example, creating a patient safety incident response plan lends itself well to a large acute trust, but not a small GP practice. So what does that mean in primary care then? So since we published the documents in August, we worked with we created like a working group for primary care, which was meant to be generic primary care, but ended up becoming quite quickly general practice focused. So we've been working on the idea of what would PSERF look like in general practice. So we've got some questions and answers. We've got some content. We are working with a whole bunch of stakeholders. It's going to be aligned with and a kind of revised patient safety strategy specifically for primary care. So there's lots of stuff still to be done there, and just thinking about the stakeholder engagement needed to kind of move things forward in general practice. There's still work to be done in dentistry, in optometry, pharmacy, and so on. So there's tons of stuff to be done there. I think there's always things to be done, because as people start to use things, you realize, oh, that isn't how I thought it would be used. Not necessarily because people don't know how to use it, but because of the way it's been designed. So things like the training requirements for PSEF, I think, that one of the big things for me is to try and think how we can make them more sustainable over time. I think at the moment, having 6 hours of this and 12 hours of that have been quite helpful to get us over the mark and to get people thinking about SEEPs and thinking about systems thinking and all those types of things. But going forward, the cost of that for organizations, and as people move around, how can we make that more sustainable and less of a tick box activity? And how can we design it in a way that creates the professionalization of these roles? HSSIB are quite very on board with this, professionalizing the role of an investigator. And so through the kind of training requirements, we can hopefully the way we design them can start to promote some of that as well. So I think looking at the training, we're also looking at the developments of the engagement guidance. So that's going to be revised. When we published it, it wasn't the Learn Together research program so the researchers that we collaborated with alongside HSIB to develop that guidance, the research was still ongoing, and they found a whole bunch of things that are of interest. Again, so in the guidance, it's part of it is to share a draft report with families. So before it's finalized and so on, but to share it. And through the ethnography that the researchers did, that is a lot more difficult than what it sounds as it's written in the guidance. So they've got a lot of insight around that. And so we're hoping to use things like that to inform a redesign of that guidance, and to really emphasize what we mean by kind of engagement and involvement, and really start to bring in some more stuff around inequalities and how to engage with those whose voices often don't get heard, who may not feel like they can ask questions after being affected by a safety event. So things like that, we want to build in and to improve in the guidance. So we'll be doing that as well. And then it's just ongoing, because even just thinking about patient safety incident response planning, I think, as organizations start to do their plans, that what plans look like now will be, in 12 months time, organizations will look back and think, what were we thinking? And so the stuff we can do nationally to take some of that learning about how organizations are revising their plans to improve our national plan for, the template for everyone. So there's loads of stuff that we can continue doing. And we've just started we were able to get some funding to do some research. We commissioned through the NIHR some research around safety management systems. So I kind of I would see, although we're exploring this, PSEF as a good base for kind of looking under, if you're thinking about patient safety incident response planning, it's a real opportunity to look at your risks and how you're managing those risks, and how you may want to proactively mitigate some of those risks you identify as part of your planning. And so I see PSEF almost as a good foundation for making these links to wider, to how we manage safety more broadly, and making that more systematic. So, and we have some research that's ongoing that's looking at SMSs, particularly within healthcare. So building on the HSSIB report, but looking at how healthcare has interpreted the SMSs across, worldwide, to help inform some of the work that we do in the national team. And then we've brought together a group of, individuals across NHS, but also in other industries, to really think about what an SMS means in healthcare. So there's that work that's ongoing. So it's always there's always stuff to do.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear how, something like PSAFE, yes, it's launched, but actually there's a lot of learning, there's a lot of research that's being carried out, which actually will feed into build and develop PSAFE, how we respond to incidents in the future. What has surprised you most about this role?
Oh, that's a good question. I think, I think what surprised me the most, maybe not so much about the role. I mean, first thing that comes to mind is just how far these processes touch everything, so it's not, it's thinking, and maybe this shouldn't surprise me because it's just, thinking about a systems approach, but how it affects the work of legal teams, how it affects the work of HR, how it links to how the MHRA regulate blood products, because in their regulation, in how they do that, they require an RCA, how it links to screening guidance, how it links to the coroners. So all these, CQC inspections, all these different parts of the system. And it's as much, that I think maybe even it's those wider organizational, like regulatory impacts that impact behavior so much more than the systems that are in place within the organization, if that makes sense. So even though PSAFE is very much focused on this is how you build your processes for learning and improvement within your organization, and then potentially in the future across systems at ICSs and so on, it's all those wider influences that really drive behavior. And so that's kind of, I guess, what I've spent since we published, I spent a large proportion of my time on is really these other wider influences, particularly around, there's been a lot of interest from legal teams. I mean, now it doesn't seem so surprising as it did at the time, thinking about the impact on coroners courts and so on. So I think that's been what you come into it thinking about, serious incidents, you do investigations, but it is just so much broader than that. So
and just thinking more broadly about human factors and you as a human factors specialist, what skills or qualities do you admire in other human factors specialists or other colleagues that you really admire and envy? Admire.
So human factors colleagues that I admire, well, yeah. I mean, I think it would be people who I've worked closely with. So Laura Pickup for sure. And just how, I guess, just has this way of understanding really in-depth human factors concepts, but being able to apply them and use them in a way that are meaningful for everyone, if that makes sense. So has a real way of of really trying to bring people along with her. Like I remember when I think I'd gone on maternity leave and I went back to HSIB, and then I realized Laura was there. I was like, oh, it was very very excited about that. So I think definitely Laura, Paul Bowie, I've worked really closely with him on a whole bunch of things. And, the more you get to know him, the more you see he's just got so much going on. Like he's just in everything, but it's just, and I think it's about the way people communicate. Like I really like the way he communicates things and can sell human factors in a really sensible, usable way, and is really about giving it away to people, trying to encourage people to bring these kind of principles into their everyday work. And I kind of really can get on board with that. I think there's a place for human factors professionals as experts, but then there's also the place for bringing people along with you and not alienating people from the discipline. And he does that really well. So I'll just pick the two. I mean, I could go on.
What's really handy though, Tracey, is that you mentioned Laura. Spoiler alert, we've recorded an episode with Laura for series 2. So hopefully people will think, oh, I need to listen to Laura now. But it's also a good way of me to think, right, who else should I invite on the podcast? And Paul's been on my hit list for a while.
Yeah, good luck trying to pin him down.
I know that's the problem, isn't it? He's too busy. If you had 10 times the courage, what would you do? And that's a really hard question.
I had 10 times the courage. Could it be like 10 times the time?
Yeah.
I mean, because I would I don't know. I mean, I get really caught up in language and what it means and how we use that to communicate safety. And so some of there are things that I have, ideas I hold in my head that I'm not able to communicate very well. And if I just had more time, I could spend a lot of time and study them. So even just thinking about things like accountability, things like Todd Conklin would be another hero of mine. And when I listen to his podcast, because I'm a big podcast fan, he talks about we're not managing risk, we're managing conditions. And so there are all these different concepts around safety that I think we're yet to break down, I think. And they're used quite a lot. So I think if I had more time, I would try to really break those down and make them into a easier story to tell. And if I had more courage, I would challenge things more around things like zero harm and things like that. I mean, I do try to challenge them when I can, but whether or not I have the energy, I don't know.
That's a great answer, particularly because I really put you on the spot with that question. So thank you for that. And thank you for your time, Tracey. You've given us a really lovely description of some of the HF projects that you've been in over your career, some of the challenges, but a really good insight into the brilliant work that you're doing at the moment. So thank you very much for your time, and thanks for sharing your thoughts and your stories.
No problem. I hope people find it useful.